So let's take a minute to talk about predecessors. So it's very tempting for a project manager once they've got some tasks listed out. And if you have a good idea in your mind about when exactly you expect some of this work to begin, based on where you are with initial project conversations that you've had with your team members, it's very tempting to go ahead and just start adding start and finish dates to all the items you've got listed here. Don't do that. Instead, we want to leverage what we've got for predecessor relationships, and that's going to be exceptionally useful, especially in the event that we have any dates that need to shift throughout the course of a project, which almost always happens, as well as anytime you want to use what you've got for an existing project schedule and to be able to repurpose that in such a way that it now becomes a template that you can use further down the road or share with others that might be in a similar situation with a new project that's been requested. So let's go ahead and get some duration set for what we have for our initiation phase, and then we'll talk about how we get some predecessors identified for each of these rows. So as I'm adding in durations, you can see that I'm doing a single keystroke for a number and then hitting return to go to the next line. By default, if I don't give it anything more than just a number, it's going to assume that I'm talking about days. I could just as easily change that, and instead of saying 10 days, redefine this as 2 weeks. And that would work just as well. But I need to put 2W to indicate that that is a week duration as opposed to a day duration. Now let's start working on what we have for predecessor relationships. Again, as a reminder, a predecessor relationship is simply saying this row that I'm looking at right now is directly related to some other row, and that's how I want to define when exactly the start and finish dates are going to be populated for me, so that I don't have to think about that on my own. So in this case, I'm saying that the gathering of project team resources is going to happen after I do the assembly of the steering committee. Additionally, I'm going to say that I'm going to draft my project charter after I've got my project team resources assembled. And then lastly, I'm not going to work on finalizing that project charter until I've at least got a project charter drafted. So this is the simplest way that we can define predecessor relationships. So let's go ahead and set a start date for when we're going to have that first task begin. Let's say that it's going to begin tomorrow. I'll do T for today, +1 gives me the date for tomorrow. And not only can we see that the dates have populated for what we have for this first task, but because we know that we have the start date that we defined, we have the duration, it's able to populate for us what we have for the finish date. In addition to that, because we've already given it predecessor relationships, it knows that once we've got the finish date for whatever that predecessor was, it'll define for us what we have for the start and finish dates for that row as well. And it cascades throughout for all the instances in which we defined a predecessor relationship. Additionally, on the right-hand side, we can now see that we've got some information populating for what we have for our Gantt chart. At a glance, we can see what we have for the next coming week. Starting on a Monday, we've got 3 days of our first task, followed by 2 days of our next task. And then we can see it skips over what we've got for Saturday and Sunday, the next task beginning on the following Monday. Now, this is specifically because of how we have the defaults set up for this particular project plan. The schedule is only looking at those dates which have been defined as working days. In this case, out of the box, it's going to look for Monday through Friday. That's something that if we needed to, we could change. And it's not uncommon for us to need to do some activities over a weekend. Think about planned downtimes or any activities related to a cutover. When we're trying to do those sorts of activities when we have as little usage of the system as possible, it might be something that we're actually intentionally trying to do something on a Saturday or a Sunday. If we need to do that, and if we want our project plan to observe those dates for what we have as schedulable tasks, we can come up to what we have for the gear icon in the top right. That's going to let us edit the project settings. Like I mentioned, out of the box, it's going to be observing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday as our working days. If we click on Edit, we can add Saturday and Sunday to the mix. Click OK. And now we can see that we've removed any of those blocked times where we were previously seeing Saturday and Sundays as basically burned days. Instead, now it's observing those as work days for us to be able to make sure that the tasks are immediately following whatever it had for its predecessor, irregardless of what day of the week that activity happens to fall on. For the purposes of this project plan, I'm actually going to revert it back to the way it was, just so we keep those Saturdays and Sundays as non-working days for what we're doing on this particular plan. So now that we're back to a spot where we've got all the details listed out for what we've done for our initiation phase, let's go ahead and do something similar to what we got for our planning phase, durations and predecessors. So now that we've added durations and predecessor relationships for what we have in the planning phase of the project, we can see that we've already got dates populated for that as well. Again, once we know what the dates are for the predecessor, we can define what we've got for that row as well. But one thing that we did do that's a little bit different about this, if you take a look at row 8, defining the requirements, the predecessor relationship that we've defined is not to the row immediately above it, which in this case would have been finalizing the project charter, row 5. Instead, we've set that predecessor relationship to the initiation phase parent row, and we've done that intentionally to make sure that this plan is as flexible as possible down the road if we were to need to make modifications to the initiation phase rows that we have up above. Specifically, if we were to add an item in here, I'm going to insert a row. I'll say that we need an additional step to double check and make sure all of our governance processes are checked off. Might take us as much as 3 days. I'm going to go ahead and change the predecessor relationship here. And we can see that as I did that, it shifted everything in the initiation phase out by 3 days. If we hadn't made our explicit reference to what we had at the parent level, we may or may not be capturing everything that we need to have as far as any shifts for anything that needs to happen downstream. As long as you're linking your first task within a given parent row grouping to whatever we had for the previous phase, in this case, the parent row directly up above it, we're future-proofing this in such a way that as we add and remove rows, we're never going to be in a situation where we're breaking our project plan. Or at least if we are making adjustments, it's going to be easy to reference going forward. So let's take what we've done so far and go ahead and populate this out for some of the additional rows, now moving to the execution phase. Now that we have some of our durations and our predecessor relationships set for what we have for the execution phase, let's take a look at something else that we can do to make this more robust, make it better thought out for how some of these actions need to take place, specifically along the lines of testing relative to the build and configuration. For unit testing, we can typically think of this as the set of activities that an individual engineer or analyst is going to be doing as they're moving through their build stages for what they need to accomplish. Basically, I built something, I'm going to test it to make sure what I built is behaving as I expect it for that one unit that I just created. That's not something that we would typically wait until we're done with all the build before we do, but instead, I'm going to test along the way. And especially if I have some documentation or quality assurance that I need to be doing as I check things off, that's going to be useful to make sure that I'm doing that in the moment in which I've accomplished the build that I'm working on. So instead of having that directly after what we have for the application configuration build task, I'm going to instead define a more unique predecessor relationship that instead of waiting until it finishes, I'm going to actually have it finish at the same time. And to do this, I'm going to click into the cell for where I have the predecessor relationship, click on the pencil icon to bring up the Edit Predecessors dialog window, and change the type of relationship that we're looking at here from Finish Start, or FS, to Finish Finish, or FF. And what we can see happening whenever we do that is we now have both of those stacked on top of one another, but because one of the durations is slightly longer, we have a 4-week window for configuration versus just a 3-week window for unit testing, we can see that it's offset just a little bit so that we have the finish activities happening at the same time for both of those tasks. Understanding that it might be more realistic for me to make sure that we have at least a 24-hour grace period for our engineers and our analysts to be able to make sure that we're finalizing those details for whatever they just wrapped up on the final day of the build, I'm going to add one more element to this. I'm going to go back into what we had for the Edit Predecessors window. I'm going to add a lag of 1 day. We can see that now that is ever so slightly shifted what we have for the unit testing efforts, so that rather than finishing on exactly the same date as what we have for the application configuration and build, it's finishing on that same date plus 1 day. So now let's move on to what we have for the training piece of this project schedule. So I've gone ahead and populated the durations for what we have for some of the training activities that are going to be required for this project. So typically in other examples that we've given up above, we would have referenced the immediately prior tasks so that we can populate the dates based on predecessor relationships for what we're working on here. But training is a little different. So in most projects, the activities related to what we're doing for training of end users should be directly tied to whenever we have the go-live date that is scheduled for the project, which will of course relate to what we have for the other execution steps, but it's really the go-live date that we want to anchor to, not the completion of the build or any of the testing efforts. So in this case, I'm actually going to start with what we have for end user training. That's the last stage of what we have for the training activities, and make sure that we're mapping that directly to what we have for the go-live task that we have listed down below. So again, instead of referencing rows above, I'm going to actually look to the direct reference for what we have for the go-live date, which is a much better thing to anchor to when we're talking about training activities. So starting for the relationship for what we have for conducting end user training relative to go-live, I'm going to set that as the row that we're looking to. So what we're using here is yet another different relationship type for what we have for this predecessor. In this case, we're using the start-finish relationship, basically saying that instead of the typical fashion where we use a finish start, or FS, we're going to put that in reverse, such that the activities that we're doing for conducting end-user training need to conclude immediately prior to what we have for the go-live date itself. Knowing that no training effort is ever 100% perfect, I'm going to build us a little bit of a grace period as well, just to make sure that we have a buffer between what we have for the conclusion of end-user training and the actual go-live date itself. So in this case, I'm actually going to be doing a different type of lag. In this case, we're setting it as 5 days lag. And you'll notice that I didn't jump into the pencil icon to do that. You can do this shorthand directly within the cell without having to go into that window. As long as you're using the right syntax, you can do it directly into the cell itself. So to test this, to make sure that this is working the way that we expect it and to give us a visual to be able to look at, let's go ahead and set what we've got for a go-live date manually. We'll come back and change it with predecessor relationships in just a bit, but just to give us an idea of whether or not row 30 for end user training is falling where we want to see it fall, let's go ahead and set a date manually right now. So with that, we can see that by defining the relationship between end user training as a start-finish relationship, we're backing up what we have for end user training relative to when we have the go-live date. Furthermore, by setting a negative 5-day lag between the conclusion of end user training and what we have for the go-live date, which we manually set, we've given ourselves a 5-day buffer just to make sure that if there is anything that happens that needs to be accounted for, that needs to be made up in that time frame, we have a little bit of a grace period to be able to accomplish that. So that's what the 34SF minus 5 days is representing here within this predecessor relationship. We've now removed what we had for the date that we were manually setting for the go-live date, just so we could test the end user training predecessors. Now we're going to go ahead and add in the predecessors for what we have for the other training tasks. As you can see, in a similar fashion, we've added SF predecessor types for all the different items that we've got in the training grouping, which means that all of these are built in the reverse fashion, starting for what we have for the anchor date and working our way backwards, just like we did for the end user training relative to go live. Let's once again add a manually added go live date just to make sure this is working as expected. So we can see we have our stair-step fashion, but again, this is one that we built from the back to the front. So in this case, we've got all of our items directly lined up for what we have for the immediately preceding item, but it's going to be in the reverse order.